Hello, everybody. Here we are back at another episode of Utterly Understandable. I've got Robbie Turner here with me. Last week we talked about the supply side factors that impact on dairy. This week we're going to talk about demand side. So, Robbie, do you want to talk about some of the key sort of demand side factors that are on your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Hamish. Like you said, we had a look at longer term trends and supply side. So to kind of balance that out, if we think about demand side, it's a very different picture. Supply, we've previously talked about how it comes on in tranches. We mentioned how it's not growing at the same rate, and potentially even declining as time goes on. What we're seeing in demand is almost the inverse of that. Demand, in the traditional markets, they are relatively stagnant due to, alternatives coming in. We can talk a bit about that later. But in the emerging markets, in the lower income markets, demand is actually growing, and it's growing quite quickly. And that growth is linked to growths in real wages, real incomes. We saw that really heavily in China over the past 20 years. That's been a big theme. And as we, think more about, the increase in incomes in India, in Latin America, and in Africa, that's going to continue as well. And given the relative populations of these places versus, the somewhat limited supply that we've seen last time, there's definitely potential for some demand-led price increases, in the future horizon. And, that will bring a whole new wave of volatility to what I consider to be an already very volatile marketplace. And we already see this today if we think about places like Venezuela, Algeria, our petrodollar economies, whose income, whose wealth is tied very closely to oil exports. At the moment, oil prices, I believe 95 a barrel today, hitting highs that haven't been seen for quite some time. That's going to translate into purchasing power. And that's going to, see events on GDT and other spot market interactions. We'll see a reallocation of goods to those economies as they can now pay, higher rates for them and demand more of them at similar pricing levels. As, these economies grow, as these economies increase their wealth, they're going to continue to, go after that demand, and, exporters are going to continue to cover those markets. So with that in mind, I think the export landscape is in for a lot more volatility, and I, would look, given the relative relationship between supply and demand, for that volatility to potentially spike upwards dramatically from time to time. When we think about, your more traditional dairy markets, your more established markets, USA, Europe, for example, these are very mature, and demand really increases at the rate of population growth, give or take. And in these markets, that's really stagnant, and it has been for some time, and will, only continue down that way. Then if we add into the mix alternatives coming to market, the increasing popularity of almond milk, soy milk, oat milk, other substitutes, these are becoming, much, much more prevalent than even just 3-5 years ago, not to mention 10 years ago. And with that, with a new generation of consumers coming to market who value these alternatives to a higher degree than previously experienced, that too is potentially going to add, make the European and USA markets, make those producers think more about exporting. It's going to present more challenges in their internal at-home markets, if you will. And what I think is quite interesting is, I would say the dairy industry has been a bit slow to actually get on board with these trends. These are no longer marginal activities occurring on the fringe of the market. Oat milks, etc. These are becoming a much more embedded, much more mainstream product. And I think this is something, that potentially could add a huge degree of downward pressure on these traditionally internal high-priced consumer markets. So that would be something, on the downside that I would be very conscious of as to how dairy firms are going to continue to react to that.
Okay, well, thanks, Robbie. Thanks for that summary of what you see as the key demand side factors that are impacting on dairy. And no doubt, like you say, we'll continue to see a fair level of volatility sort of continuing as we have over the last 10 years. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Udderly Understandable, and we'll see you next time.